Hello, I'm Deborah Malone, founder of The Internationalist and host of Internationalist Marketing TV. Today's guest is Kate Price, a partner at Profit, a growth and transformation consultancy. Kate, it is a pleasure to welcome you to the show. I am fascinated to learn all about brand and demand research. So welcome, welcome, welcome.
Thank you so much. I'm excited to share it. And I think you've probably also seen it's a little bit of a love story. So today, maybe it's not Valentine's Day, but we could all use a little love in our lives, right?
I do think we could all use a little love story at this point in the geopolitical scheme of things. So before we start with love stories or research or whatever we might want to call it, let's talk a little bit just about Profit, just to set the tone, because your company is pretty interesting. I mean, it is a global consultancy where you actually bridge brand strategy with creative execution. So just tell us a little bit more about that.
Yeah, no, it's super great actually. I mean, it's one, and I've only been here a couple of years, 2 years, but it's really one of the reasons that I joined this organization is this sort of both brand strategy and creative execution part of it. Now, as an organization, we've been around, I don't know, 15 to 30 years, and at this point, we're one of the largest privately held consultant organizations, and that kind of allows us to do a couple things. What we're super proud of is the fact that, like many consultancy groups, we really are looking at growth for our clients, right? But growth that is driven but from a brand perspective and has very much humans at the center of it. So that's kind of where we start, which is, not necessarily super different to a lot of other organizations, but we know growth is hard and we're really pushing for that kind of uncommon growth that is sustainable.
Speaking of all parts of one's brain, you're doing something pretty interesting in your current research because you're looking at what some might call a dichotomy between brand building and performance marketing, or as you call it, brand and demand. So just talk about why you chose to look at this now. I mean, is it because in a digital era, we're more focused on immediate outcomes, or is that a significant concern to brand building or to growth as you describe it? So just talk about the why of doing this particular research now, then we'll get into the research.
So yes, all those things.
Okay, easy answer.
I mean, let's be honest, right? This is not a new topic. I've been in this space for 30 years. And, when I first started as a marketer, we were talking about, and we called it maybe something different at that point, but, should we spend more on trade marketing? Should we spend more on above the line advertising, right? And as growing up as a very classical CPG marketer, I spent an awful lot of years figuring out the best way to run an FSI. Those coupons that used to come in the newspaper, which is sort of demand performance marketing in an earlier way. And then sort of, we were talking about should it be functional or emotional advertising? And then, of course, there have been the kind of seminal pieces of work from Burnett and Field talking about kind of brand and activation and how people should balance their spend, and that kind of 60% brand and 40% activation, which everybody is like, that's really hard to do. So it's not a new subject, but there is new urgency to it. And there's new urgency for a couple reasons. One is, I think that, from a CMO and a marketing perspective, all marketers are just trying to do more with less at this point, right? There is more channels. They have a broadly wider span of control across organizations, I think. There are more capabilities that you need, and less money. Like we've heard across the board that there's less money to go around. That the size of marketing organizations is being contracted, and there is less patience for how quickly results are going to come through. So in that kind of more with less world, you've also got this digital thing. Don't know if you've heard of this digital thing, But in the digital era, right, we can measure everything. We can measure it all the time, and we can measure it immediately. And in a world where we're all looking for outcomes and there's a lot of pressure, to look at those immediate outcomes that you can measure every single day and say that that's the output. And on top of that, a lot of those kind of more very quick burst disciplines need a very high level of expertise. You need to be constantly learning kind of how to do these new skills. And so you end up with a network of highly expert humans who are able to give you numbers every day. And so those humans in the organization or those groups become the ones that people are listening to. And so you've got this triple thing, right? You need to do more with less. You can measure everything all the time if you want. And you've got this kind of very highly credible group of experts. And that sort of creates this whole narrative around the fact that the now results are the most important ones, as opposed to necessarily the sustained ones.
No, you make a good point, because it would seem then that the scale is tipping in the direction of demand, and that brand building is somehow left in the dust. But obviously, your research proves a little bit otherwise. So why don't we just take a look at the beginning at really a critical insight, which is really that there's a connection between both, to go back to your initial concept of growth, that if you want to consistently outperform the competition. Talk a little bit, and I know there's a lot to unpack here, but talk a little bit about that critical point about how together they can consistently outperform the competition.
Yeah. So, it was a really interesting moment that we had as we were doing this research. And I'll tell you, the expectation that we had going into the research was a little different than actually what we found, and not the integration piece of it, but like what we have learned across the board is that most of the conversation inside of organizations around brand and demand is, first of all, like it's an either or, and secondly, it's about budgeting. Is that like we need to make sure that we've got the right amount of budget against our brand stuff and the right amount of budget against our demand stuff. And we sort of expected, because a lot of the data out there in sort of the in the marketing science world is pointing towards the fact that actually that brand building activity is so important to longer term growth. We went in with this hypothesis of like, well, maybe those outperformers are actually spending more in their brand work because they're having a longer runway. And what we found was there was no difference between those who are outperforming their competition and those that weren't in how they spent their money. It's sort of interesting. There's sort of this like 30-30-30 split. Marketers know that they need to do the balance. And that's, I think, how people have been thinking about it. They've been thinking about it as like, oh, I've got a bucket here that's my brand work, a bucket here that's my performance work, and maybe some of this kind of joins together. We saw there was no difference. What we saw instead was that those leading marketers, those who outperform their competition, are much more likely to think about it as an an integration, and a way of being, as it were, a systemic way of thinking about how the two combine across the entire organization. So the way that the research works is basically we ask those people, are you outperforming your competition or not? And for those that were outperforming, we were trying to understand the hallmarks of those people, those organizations. And what we saw is that of those that were outperforming, they were something like 90% likely to say that they were somewhat or fully integrated. But then there was a small subset, or not smaller subset, and those that are outperforming their competition are 3 times more likely to say they are fully integrated. So they're 3 times more likely to say, we think about this brand and demand thing as we're all in it together, and you can't necessarily see the front and back of the 2 different things. We think about things as together as opposed to balance.
Now, it makes you also wonder if some of the work in some of the immediate work in on the demand side, or the performance marketing side, also somehow informs the longer term elements as well, if you get it right. Let me ask you some very quick, simpler questions, less philosophical, hopefully a little less heady, but just to try to set this up so that we get a deeper understanding. So first of all, really simple, how are marketers juggling these 2 elements? Do they have different teams that do them, or how do they juggle them?
Well,
And I know it works differently for every company. If and that's the joy of marketing. There isn't the consistency throughout in terms of how people operate.
Well, and a slight aside, right? But one of the joys of the marketing discipline is like when you go inside of each organization, it's a slight different challenge, right? It's not like accountants, they hop from one organization together and they've got the same playbook. One of the joys of marketing is that we have to keep rewriting our playbooks. I mean, I think some of it harkens back to what I just said, is they think about it from a budgeting perspective. They think about it as money and like, how much am I going to spend behind one or the other? And then I think there are different levels on a continuum of separation. And I think at one end, you might have an entire sort of growth marketing team, which is sort of a strange name, right? But a growth marketing team, which tends to be more kind of focusing on that kind of demand, what is traditionally thought of as lower funnel or the digital piece of the marketing. And your brand groups are like totally separated from each other. So that's sort of at one end of the spectrum. At the other end of the spectrum, you have a team that maybe your brand group who has P&L responsibility, who are really kind of thinking about the holistically what needs to get done, like making choices of like, where am I going to be putting my puts and takes and how am I connecting things? Then who have at their disposal the experts in the digital space, the experts in other areas to be able, and the demand space to be able to kind of advise them. And I think there's everything in between, right? And different industries do things differently, and organizations that are a branded house versus a house of brands operate differently. But I think across the board, those that are trying everything that they can, both from a hardwiring in terms of process to keep as much as those, it's not just process, it's also cultural. I think the culture piece is important, and we'll come back to that. But process and culture and goals, to kind of tie those together, are doing better than those that are kind of keeping things apart.
How do companies measure? Obviously, it's easy to measure performance marketing, so to speak. How do they measure classical brand building? Is it market share and sales, or is part of the issue that there's 2 different elements of measurement that make integration a little bit more difficult?
I think so, yeah. And I think that the measurement structures that people are able to put in place are in fact one of the most important things that people need to do, organizations need to do, in order to make this work. And I think if you were going to say, what's the one thing you can do in order to make brand and demand work together, it is kind of really thinking about how those measurement systems work together. And I think sort of a top to bottom approach of what are my leading measures that I can measure today, and what are the more lagging measures that I can measure quarterly, and the things that I can measure on an annual basis. And there is very much the mindset, the kind of brand measures and brand awareness measures are very much the soft measures. And that obviously the business outcomes the hard measures, but the daily measures, which everybody says are vanity metrics, they can, like, did I click through? Did I get engagement? Did I get something out of it? There is broad agreement that those things aren't necessarily the right thing to look at, but they look at them anyway because they can, and they say something. So I think trying to find ways to make sure that those measurement systems all work together is the key. And actually, I personally have like my favorite measures, which are customer or people based. So if you can find a way that your lagging measure is how many new people did I get this year? How many of my current people bought more? And how many of my current people didn't leave me? And how many of my current people spent more? Both your brand and your demand people, if you've got them separated, can sort of agree on those measures, right? Oh, we have a customer acquisition target. Let's think about that over the course of the full year. Oh, we need to make sure our churn results are working. Let's think about that over the course of the first year. And then I think if you're anchored in those measures, I actually think it makes it much easier to push up and down into the different kinds of approaches.
No, I think you bring up a very good point. And I think that is a great starting point. And it also demonstrates how they can work together. And I love your analogy of things being people-based, because it does make it more real. Just mention, if you wouldn't mind mentioning, because I believe that the research also had 6 key actions that both winning brand and demand integrators had in common. Do you want to just run through that very quickly?
I do. And, here's where the love story sort of comes in, right? And I think it's a love story because it helps make it sticky, and it helps me to remember kind of how these things fit together. But it's also a little bit of fun, right? So I think the first kind of thought here is we need to find a way that we both want the same thing, kind of thing, right? So we need to make sure that, and it goes right back to that thing we literally just talked about, which is, okay, do we have shared goals? Are we able to say at the end of the day, whatever team I'm on, whatever my goal might be for this week or activity I'm working on this week, it's laddering up to the same goal. So do we want the same thing? The second is like, do we have a shared values or shared passion? And one of the things that we noticed is that these integrated organizations are just way more enthusiastic about their customers. They're just thinking about their customers, their consumers all the time. And that's how they're making their decisions. They're like, oh, is this? And it comes again back to that question about people. Like if you're able to put all of your thinking to be about human beings or people or their behavior, then actually, thinking about what they need almost at all times is super important. So that's key. The next thing is this idea that celebrating the differences that different kinds of people and different disciplines actually bring to the game. I think one of the things that I really loved about the research is this idea that those winning CMOs and winning teams are much more likely to say things like, we can balance logic and creativity really well. We can balance data and emotion very well. So kind of that and mindset, that both of those things are critical in this game, I think are really great. Also, they say, we are excellent at brand and we are excellent at demand. It's not like we actually are really, really skilled in both of those things. But this idea that actually it's magic and logic combined, and there is no cultural divide between those things. Sometimes I see in organizations, right, the creative people are like more important, or the data people are more important. And it's kind of those unsaid rules that I think are important. The fourth thing is about embracing the struggle. Those organizations that do the best are the ones that are actually more likely to say, this is hard and I can't keep up. That was a surprise to us. Because I think it's that first thing of like, oh, I have to admit that it's hard. in order for me to be able to overcome it. But what's also super fun about that is that those organizations also love that. They love that it's dynamic. They love that it's about driving change. And I think that's one of those kind of fundamental truths of being a marketer in today's environment is that yes, it's hard, but yes, they love it. So kind of both of those two things together. Short and long-term measures, that's our fifth thing. Like, I think we've talked about that, but some of that is about confidence with stakeholders. It's not a technical ability to be able to measure things in the short term and in the long term. It's actually the confidence to be able to explain that to the entire organization of how that long-term, short-term, immediate, sustained impact works. And then finally, and I often think about this one as kind of managing the in-laws, right? Like every relationship sits inside of a big family. And so you have to make sure that you're managing the kind of extended family as well as your own family. So are you bringing the CTO and the CIO and the CFO and the CHRO along the journey? Because by bringing them along the journey, that's actually going to really help you drive success. So those are the 6.
And I think you've also described the way to a perfect marriage. So hence your love story. No, you make a lot of wonderful points. And you also, you emphasize in a lot of cases, the human element of it. And certainly the human element of integrating any kind of a long-term brand journey. However, we are now at a point in our development where we're not only thinking about things human, but we're also thinking about artificial intelligence. So I'm just wondering what you think, what you quite personally think about how AI would affect both aspects of brand and demand. I think that just naturally we would assume that, given that AI is often personalization at scale, that it would certainly help the demand side, the performance marketing side. Yet, on the other hand, the way that AI can analyze data and offer insights and so on might also help in getting closer to that human being, that customer, and so on. So I don't know, based on the research and your own experience with so many marketers, where are we going next?
Well, that's a very small topic we're just jumping into now, right? But a really a great one. And yeah, we did actually, as part of this, obviously we kind of snuck in some questions about AI, and as you would predict, the ones that were performing better were further down the curve of thinking about AI. And as a marketer, I think, having a very structured approach to this is, I think, one of the important things. Now, I'm not an AI expert, and we have people on our team they're the AI expert people, but I really do personally try to lean in where I can. Like, we have an hour, 60 minutes a week that I kind of join a conversation about what we're doing from an AI perspective. And then I have a little personal anecdote, which is when ChatGPT was first released, I was in a small period of my life where I was writing a poem every day. And what I realized, I was working so hard with these poems, like every day, like writing a poem every day is a lot of work. And actually ChatGPT, I realized, was really, really good at writing poems. So it was like a little moment, like right at that launch, where I was like, wow, there's something here. It's particularly good at rhyming. Anyway, so
wait, you haven't finished the story. Did you give up on poetry or
no? I was like, you know what? I gotta beat the
machine.
Beat the machine. Yeah, I mean, the machine doesn't know my entire story, right? But it's just like, it is actually kind of a classic, like, the AI can do creative things, but it can't tell my story.
Let's hope not.
Yet. I do think there is an element of the fact that we are starting to bucket everything that used to be called digital as AI, right? And I also I love to follow the Gartner hype cycles, and I did notice that Gen AI is kind of coming up to the top, that like kind of peak point in the hype cycle. So it's starting to slide down the other side, which means that it's super urgent that we actually really figure out how to best use AI. And I think you're right. Like we have been using AI in marketing for quite some time, in programmatic, um, in personalization, et cetera, et cetera. And I think it's really important that we over pivot in trying to use AI in the best possible way. But at the same time, I'm also thinking about it from a systematic perspective. I mean, I think we've had we've passed the point where it should be like, oh, let's just experiment and see what happens. Like that's not where we are now. Instead, I think we have to think of it in terms of marketing capability, right? So what do I need to be great at as a marketing organization, and how can AI help me deliver against that? So you've said consumer insights. How can I make sure, like unstructured data, making sure that I am using AI in the right ways, and AI can make us more efficient, or it can make us better. So how do I make sure that AI is making me more efficient in my consumer insights, and how is it making me better? So it can help me with summarizing things, or it can help me. I mean, I've heard of organizations doing synthetic
Panels.
synthetic digital twins, which I think is really cool. I mean, it's so cool. And then from a branding perspective, it can help me with my brand governance to make sure that, if I've got a global brand and I've got 40 people or 100 people touching my brand, it can help with brand governance, or it can help with brand creativity. And, if you just move down each of the capabilities in innovation, in financial performance, in like, what are the ways that we need to build our capabilities or increase efficiency in capabilities, to me, that is like the way to think about AI, and then finding the right use cases and pushing them out as far as we can. So it's the same as how we all learned how to build our capabilities over the last 15 years. It's just the next level. It's a sort of a balance of experimentation and systematic thinking.
No, it is the next level, and I know that organizationally sometimes it's not always easy to integrate, when there are different functions and silos and so on and so forth. But somehow there always seems to be a scary element to it when you have the science fiction of thinking that the robots are taking over. I don't want to get into anything scary now. I'm actually quite curious because you started in many ways saying that when you did the research, you had certain expectations, and which I think is always very interesting when certain things occur and expectations change, so to speak, or you can learn something from them. I mean, the study, you actually surveyed 300 marketers in North America, and I'm assuming they're a mix of your own clients and other marketers who sign up for your research and so on. I just wonder if there were some specific comments or something you didn't expect that jumped out at you from all that personal interaction.
Yeah, and in all these things, the quant work tells you one side of the story, and the qualitative, in-depth interviews that we had, like every conversation I come out of, I'm like, oh yeah, right, of course. And I think it's a combination of the things that we expected. I think that, marketers are brilliant soundbiters, and they say things in a snappy way that like, you're like, oh yeah, right. And like, so one of my favorite quotes, is the idea of the and the both is critical. There is no long term without the short term. Like, and I sort of love that idea that, yeah, we can be thinking about the long term, but we absolutely have to be delivering the short term today. So I thought that was like a really interesting way of phrasing it. But then I actually there was another kind of angle in that I heard, which is the same but upside down, which is I'm thinking about the long term all the time, every single day. Sometimes I'm not acting for the long term. I actually have to put my resources into the short term, but I'm still thinking about the long term. So just sort of that kind of the way that these senior people are really balancing this this long and short term, and there's a kind they do have a philosophy in their head that they're living with. I just thought that's sort of interesting in itself. And then I think the other kind of big theme was just this idea of kind of it's about the business. I don't know if that's a surprise, but it's just a great reinforcement. That one of the CMOs talked about, yeah, I have an active seat at the table and I actively work to make sure that marketing's response to our overall goals is consistent with how we're running the business. And it sounds obvious, but at the same time, like it's actually, that is the key. And then the joy that comes with that is this idea that, and again, like another quote is, I love that marketing is at the center. I feel like I run a business, but I also get to do the human touch and the creative side. So some of those kind of snappy ways about thinking about marketing, I just think are sort of helpful. On top of that, all the data that sort of showed us, it's time to move beyond the conversation around budgeting and much more about, well, we're trying to line the whole organization up to deliver against these kind of shorter and sustained goals. I think was really kind of the crux of what we thought about.
So if you had to give someone advice, someone who wasn't part of your survey, if you wanted to leave a marketer with what you thought they should learn or what they should take away from this in one of those snappy terms, what would it be?
For me, it's the word and. Never think about your marketing in or terms. Don't pit one thing against the other. Think about and. Now and sustained. Creativity and logic. People and business. It would really be where I would have people focus.
Well, I think that you have summed up in a very eloquent one word some research that is important at this moment in time, and it's also has its complexities as well. And you've done a great job in sharing that. And I think we can all remember the and we should probably go back and download the survey so that we can see all of those items that we have to sew together and integrate. So you have been terrific in taking a very difficult subject and really making it very personable. So thank you so much, Kate. We really look forward to keeping up with this and other research and data from Profit.
Thank you so much. It's been so much fun.
The Internationalist focuses on the continual reinvention of marketing by highlighting inspirational marketers around the world and their ideas as they move the industry forward. Internationalist Marketing TV shares these perspectives through interviews and personal stories. Thanks so much for watching. If you find this kind of content helpful, please click like or subscribe. Again, thanks so much.